Welcome to the Cyber Center for Biblical Studies. Hi, my name's Herb Bateman. Today we're going to focus attention on the Gospel of Mark. Scott Barger, Senior Pastor of New Horizon Community Church, is here with us to help direct our discussion as we think our way through the Gospel of Mark. Scott, welcome.
Thanks, Herb. So, Gospel of Mark. Authorship, right? It may not seem like a big mystery, but which Mark is the Mark of the Gospel of Mark?
Well, because he doesn't identify himself,
Right.
It is problematic as to knowing exactly who may have written the Gospel of Mark. From my perspective, I'm content in thinking that it is John Mark, the fellow who went with Paul and Barnabas on the first missionary journey, the fellow that Paul requests that Mark come and bring a cloak to him at the end of his life while he's under imprisonment in Rome. So my tendency is to view the gospel writer to be John Mark. But I will not go to the wall for such a perspective. There are other things worth dying for. That's not one of them.
Sure. Well, and again, as a lot of books, authorship maybe not always the most important determining factor when it comes to interpretation, but I would think that coming up with what the main idea or the central theme of the letter, it would be very helpful. What would you think, in your words, what's the central theme of the Gospel of Mark?
Well, as I think about the Gospel of Mark, there are two predominant subjects in the Gospel. You've got Jesus, and then you've got his discipleship. You've got his disciples. So one of the themes that you're going to have is Messiah, and what type of Messiah he is. He's a suffering Messiah. And then you're going to have discipleship, and this idea of discipleship being a call to suffering. So I think of the theme of this movement of Messiah to a suffering Messiah, and movement of discipleship being one of suffering, are two themes that are joined together in this book. If I were to try to put this into a single statement, how might I frame it? I might frame it this way. Those who confess Jesus as their Davidic Messiah on the basis of his mighty deeds and words must be willing to follow him the way of suffering. And so that's what I think about when I think about this book on the Gospel of Mark. It's a recounting of Jesus, but it's been framed to address a specific need of this church, who I think is in Rome, that Mark is writing to, because they have misunderstood what it means to be a disciple or a follower of Jesus.
So you mentioned that you think maybe the audience is located in Rome, or the intended audience, and alluded to an occasion for the writing of the letter that maybe they're misunderstanding the essence of discipleship. Why don't you expand that idea a little bit for us?
Well, when we think about some of the things that are happening in the gospel itself about disciples, and even about Jesus, the first half of the book we have Jesus downplaying the fact that he is the Christ. He's not willing to publicly make that announcement. He hushes demons, or he hushes the disciples from saying anything, because he wants to define his messiahship in his terms. And so that first half of the book, as people are seeing and hearing him teach and perform miracles, they're saying, who is this man? Who is this guy? And of course, that declaration emerges with Peter saying, he is the Christ. But then the question that comes out, what type of Christ is he? And he's a suffering Christ, or he's a suffering Messiah. And throughout this whole book, you've got this misunderstanding of the disciples. Jesus teaches them, they don't get it. He teaches them again, they don't get it. He teaches them again, They don't get it. So one of the things that comes out in this book is the failures of the disciples. And so here are a few things that I've written that I think are pretty pertinent to this idea. Mark's portrayal of a disciple pictures the progress of being a disciple as being surrounding misunderstandings of a disciple and failures of being a disciple. He points out that discipleship is a paradox, and that it involves both failures and successes. Sometimes they're on a mountaintop. Peter, you are the Christ. And then next thing you know, Jesus is chastening him because he's misunderstood his messiahship. And so there's these mountaintop successes followed by failure. But despite the failures, Mark's always pointing out that Jesus, as risen Lord, is constantly renewing this invitation to follow him. And, you see this particularly in Peter at the end, where he denies Jesus for them. But yet you've got this renewal going on and this affirming of Peter. And so I think there's this occasion, whatever's happening that's causing this, there is doubt, there is a misunderstanding of being a disciple. And of course, Mark is correcting the notion that Christian discipleship is an easy, selective smorgasbord. I think the occasion is that this group of believers have misunderstood Jesus as Messiah, and they are failing in their following of Jesus. There are failures and successes, and so Mark is encouraging them in some ways.
So, in your opinion, what's the most significant element in the Gospel of Mark? Something that you think is really kind of powerful and speaks to you?
Well, I think when you look at the first half of the book, you've got like 11 miracles, and people are enamored by what it is that Jesus can do for them. And there's this following that comes, and the teaching. Oh, who is this guy? He teaches with such authority, and look what he can do. And then when you get to the latter half of the book, there's only one or two miracles that appear, because the focus of the latter half of the book is on the fact that Jesus is not a genie in a bottle who grants your every wish, but Jesus is a Messiah who's a suffering Messiah, and we're called to suffer with him. So I think the thing that really stands out in my mind when I think about the Gospel of Mark is that a call to discipleship is a call to suffering, which I think in our circles at times, we just think to follow Jesus is just everything's going to be fine, and there's not going to be trouble, and there's not going to be suffering, when in reality, the Gospel of Mark tells us there will be suffering, and you should plan to suffer, because in much the same way as Messiah suffered, we should be ready and willing to suffer as well. And so I think that's a very significant point in our day and age, because we always want to pray for, well, don't let me go through this, or don't let me go through this, or help me to have this, and it's that's not what the Gospel of Mark about. Jesus isn't our genie to grant our every wish. Jesus is our King, and we are to follow our King, and expect the same treatment as he received. And I think the other thing that I appreciated about this book that I think is rather significant is Jesus does not allow others to define who he is. He does not let the religious establishment define his messiahship. He defines his messiahship according to what is in keeping with God's kingdom program. And I think that's rather significant. And I think sometimes today, even in our community, we tend to define Jesus in our terms. And Mark defines Jesus in Jesus' terms. And I think that's another aspect that is rather significant. But, but having said that, I want to go back to a question I've asked you previously on other videos that we've done, because you've preached this gospel, and from what I understand, more than one time. So as you think back on your teaching and preaching of this, what were things that you wanted the folks to walk away with? What was it that was compelling to you about Jesus, that you wanted them to get their head around and to walk out a changed person because of it?
I think, obviously, discipleship is maybe the dominant theme in the book of Mark. What Jesus is teaching his disciples to do. I think that, to me, what's a feature that has always struck me about Mark is that the audience, the reader, is expected to know things and to get things even when the disciples aren't getting them. So the disciples are failing and misunderstanding, but there's always this unspoken kind of nudge from the writer to the reader. It's like, now, but you get it. You get that this is what's true about Jesus, or that this wasn't the right perspective. So I always kind of like that teaching device. It's almost kind of like watching a movie or something, when you get the audience has a fuller perspective than the players and the story do, and the disciples never quite get it. In fact, I kind of like the shorter ending of the Gospel of Mark, because in that version of the ending, the disciples still don't get it. Clear up into the end, they just don't quite understand it. And I think that the idea that Jesus called people who didn't get it, and they failed, and they misunderstood, and they ran away, and even though they witnessed so many powerful things. I love that scene when they're in between the mass feedings. There's this stories of like Jesus feeding all these people, and then they collect all the crumbs, and they feed all the people, and then collect the crumbs again, and then they're on the boat, and they forget their lunch, and Jesus is trying to teach them to be careful of the teaching of the Pharisees, and he happens to mention leaven in his teaching, and that gets the disciples not thinking about the Pharisees, but thinking about food, and they ask, well, what are we going to eat? And he's like, what? You don't, you don't get it? And I think that kind of really down to earth, almost thick-headedness, and the failures is really human. These disciples are people who fail and are normal and are not superhuman. They're not perfect. They're not floating ethereal kind of like super saints. They're struggling people who make mistakes like we are. And I think that out of all of the Gospels, that helped. I just identify with that a lot more. And I like the fact that even though that they're failing, Jesus is constantly moving them towards a following a Messiah who endures and like you said, and suffers, and revealing that to them even as they're failing is just something that's very human and very motivating to me.
What did you think in your preparation for that series?
As I recall, I'm a big fan of the NIV application commentary series. I use that for a lot of my New Testament work. They just do such a fine job of kind of focusing on the major points, looking for that kind of responsible interpretation that leads to a pertinent application. So I use that quite a bit. Word Biblical Commentary is a fallback for me, although I do remember referring to the NIGTC is pretty, as technical matters go, that helped me. And even what's the one, the Catholic commentary,
the Harrington
and Sacropagina, right? Yeah. Is that how you say it? Yeah. That I liked. Why I don't know, that one. It was kind of an odd man out. I don't typically refer to that commentary series, but that one I just liked Harrington's work on it, and it was good. And others, of course, that I breezed through. But those would be the 3 or 4 that I use most regularly.
Good. All right. Well, thank you, Scott.
Yeah.
And thank you for joining us. As I think about closing out this segment, I'd like to recommend a book or a work done by Philip Yancey entitled "To Jesus I Never Knew." And of course, there's a corresponding video series, or probably CD, that you can get of this particular work. But he presents Jesus from different portrayals of Jesus, and I think is a nice way of looking at Jesus from a contemporary standpoint. How do we in 21st century look at Jesus? And Yancey does a nice job in kind of setting that backdrop. And then go to the Gospel of Mark and see how the Gospel of Mark is portraying Jesus. But in the meantime, I want to thank you for joining us, and I trust that you will have a great day. Till next time.